Welcome. It's Reverend Mike Capron from the First Presbyterian Church of Troy, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to start out, dive right in. This week's sermon has the appealing title, Coming to Terms with Dread. Overwhelming dread. You know, sometimes I wake up on Monday knowing exactly what Bible passage and general theme I'm going to preach on the following Sunday. And there are weeks like this one when I have no idea. So I grasp around for a seed, an idea, and I have a file where I keep some notes. I looked at it. I found a note from last August where I listened to a podcast that was talking about God's creation, ecology, and lament. And I said, isn't Earth Day this week? Yeah, it was last Wednesday, the 22nd. So that might fit pretty well. So here we are. Let's make a go of it. Lament is a word we don't use very often, but there's a whole book in the Bible named Lamentations. I've never spent a lot of time with it, so I started digging in this week, and something strange happened. I discovered I like the Book of Lamentations. It's really speaking to me. I like it so much, I'm going to use it for the next week's Bible study. I think it has a lot to say about our current cultural moment. Lamentations is a book of 5 poems reflecting on a catastrophe. Their catastrophe was the sacking of the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the kidnapping of the rulers and leading citizens who were dragged off to captivity in Babylon. Now, here's one of the best methods of using the Bible. You look at the situation biblical people were in, and you look at how they responded to their situation, and then you look at the situation we are in and consider by analogy how we might respond. So let's look at their situation. There had been this catastrophe, the conquest of the holy city of Jerusalem by a hostile foreign power. And some people stepped up to respond to the situation. Some artists. Artists can be good at that. They look at a situation and find ways to express what people are feeling, to name it, to open people's hearts to understand deep in their souls what they are experiencing. In this case, it is the poets who step up. They use poetic form and carefully crafted words to lament. Now, what does it mean to lament, to make lamentation? One of the simplest definitions is to express grief loudly. Here's a more scholarly definition from one of my seminary professors, Dr. Kathleen O'Connor. Laments are prayers that erupt from words out of unbearable pain and bring it to language. Laments complain, shout, and protest. They take anger and despair before God and the community. They grieve, they argue, they find fault. Although laments appear disruptive of God's world, they are acts of fidelity. In vulnerability and honesty, they cling obstinately to God and demand for God to see, hear, and act. Laments are prayers of the discontented, the disturbed, and the distraught. That podcast I mentioned before, it had a more earthly way of describing Lamentations. One of the speakers said of Lamentations, there's something oddly comforting that there's a book in the Bible basically titled WTF, ? Which is short, of course, for what the heck. That is probably the best line I've ever heard to describe the purpose of lament, not only the Book of Lamentations, but the many psalms of lament and the various prophetic texts that take the form of lament. So this sermon will try to bring 2 things together, lament and overwhelming dread, the fear of catastrophe. Now, catastrophes come in many forms. On a personal level, it could be the death of a loved one or a medical diagnosis that looks like it will soon lead to death. On a regional level, one might imagine events such as a mass shooting or an explosion at a factory or a large forest fire consuming many homes. International events such as major wars are catastrophic and worthy of lament. Global catastrophes, threatened or realized, are even more scary. Nuclear war, climate change. Any of these, if actually realized in your life, could feel world-ending. On a personal level, we sometimes hear someone say, he or she was my whole world, and now they're gone. Or, I lived in that home for 40 years, and there's nothing left. You can lament for world-ending things at the personal level. You're allowed your laments. But we know that these things eventually happen, and some of them may happen to us, and maybe that makes them a little easier to deal with. If a beloved family member dies, that's a terrible, awful thing. But even in the midst of the shock, you kind of know what to do, right? Someone has to call the funeral home. Somehow family needs to get notified. You'll need the death certificate and the will. But for the really big things, we don't know what to do. And the bigger the threat, the bigger the emotional turmoil and confusion that goes with it. And I'm using the word dread to describe that. With that word, I mean an ominous, oppressive heaviness combined with a big dose of fear that also tends to make us feel helpless, like our individual actions have no impact at all on the threat. Lament is one of those few places you can go when you have that kind of overwhelming dread. And there isn't anything bigger or more dread-inspiring than climate change. I have a friend who's a hospital chaplain. He loves Lamentations, told me it was his favorite book in the Bible. I was surprised and asked him why, and he said, because it is so honest. So here's where I'm going for the rest of this sermon. I'm going to review a little Bible about the world and creation. And I'm going to thank one of the generations who may be hearing this sermon for something they did. And finally, I'm going to get to lament. So we better get moving. In Genesis 2, the Lord makes the first people, creates a beautiful garden for them, puts them in the garden to cultivate and to keep it. So the garden was there for their benefit, but they were also supposed to take care of it. There were also limits placed on them. One thing that they should not do because it would be bad for them. Naturally, they did that one thing, and the whole world was thrown out of kilter, so that now we live in a fallen world full of sin, where we human beings misuse God's gifts on a regular basis. And in some ways, nothing about the situation has changed in thousands of years. Greed, lust, violence are primary drivers of sinful human behavior in a fallen world. It really is the same in every generation. Except that our power has increased. Over the last 150 years, the capacity of the human race to affect global change has developed and accelerated right alongside a growing human population. These are powerful multipliers that enable us to have more and more impact on creation. And they have led us to a point of overwhelming dread from an impending climate catastrophe. It's young people who seem to feel this most acutely. Those of us born in the 20th century had a greater dread of global nuclear war. Some people hearing this may remember the famous duck and cover drills. I'm a little too young for that. But more often, young people today dread climate catastrophe, rising seas, mass species extinction, drought and water shortages, extreme heat, stronger storms and flooding, wildfires that scar the land, and crop failures that drive hunger and displacement of populations. That's a brutally honest list, but this is a sermon about coming to terms with overwhelming dread, so I stand by it. But I do want to take a moment and give a big shout out to some people. If you were born during the post-World War II baby boom, I want to thank you. You are responsible for electing people to government who took care of the environment. Heck, you pretty much started the environmental movement. You remember when the environment was not a partisan political issue. Big majorities of both parties passed most of the groundbreaking legislation to protect our air and water, to clean up pollution, and to preserve wild spaces. You set the example for the way it ought to be. Unfortunately, that positive spirit of cooperation has waned in the 21st century. In fact, someone listening to this sermon may be critical because they think I'm being political. I don't view this as a political partisan issue because I remember when it wasn't, and I'm suspicious of the motives of the people who made it political. Now we move on to lamenting. To lament is to express grief loudly and to question God as to why the catastrophic thing is happening. I'm going to do that with 5 verses from Lamentations and a few quotes from Kathleen O'Connor. In Lamentations 1, the looted and depopulated city of Jerusalem is portrayed as a grieving widow. Formerly a princess, she has now fallen into poverty and ruin, perhaps even enslavement. I'd like to suggest, for purposes of this particular sermon, that we view the earth itself as a grieving widow. Once resplendent, she has now fallen far and used as an object to service the pleasure of others. Lamentations 1:2. All night long she is weeping, tears running down her cheeks. Not one of all her lovers remains to comfort her. Her friends have all betrayed her and become her enemies. The implied question that arises from that verse is, how could this happen? Implied in that question would be the idea that this situation is so shocking as to be impossible. It is an impossible nightmare she wishes she could awaken from, but cannot. The parallel situation within us, perhaps, is to deny the risk of climate change. Global temperatures have been on an upward trend for the last 50 years. Glaciers are clearly melting faster than expected. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere. Scientific consensus is overwhelming that it is happening and that we human beings are causing it. Yet some are nonchalant, probably because the projections are too shocking and we look away. It's a form of denial. Fear of truth motivates denial. Denial refers to the refusal, perhaps even the psychic and spiritual inability to see the horrible, to name it, to allow it space in the world. Denial means to live knowingly or unknowingly with lies. This is a tricky sermon because some of you already feel the dread, and I don't want to overwhelm you. But some are not feeling the dread enough, and I'd like for you to start to feel it. Because if you don't see the risk, how can we come to terms with God's command to take care of this garden, this world? And yet there are no easy solutions. So where do we go? Lament. Lament refuses to be complacent about the situation. Complacency can arise out of numbness, but in its loud complaint, lament keeps us out of despair and complacency by loudly complaining, even questioning God. The Book of Lamentations gives voice to despair in chapter 3, verses 17 to 20. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. The thought of my affliction and helplessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. Kathleen O'Connor wrote of the danger of swallowing our pain, of repressing it. She said, pain kept from speech, pushed underground and denied, will turn and twist and tunnel like a ferret until it grows in those lightless spaces into a violent, unrecognizable monster. To lament is also to admit the possibility of hope from God. The subsequent verses 22 to 31. Surely the Lord's mercies are not over, the deeds of faithful love not exhausted. Every morning they are renewed. Great is his faithfulness. The Lord is all I have, I say to myself, and so I shall put my hope in him. The Lord is good to those who trust him, to all who search for him. It is good to wait in silence for the Lord to save. It is good for someone to bear the yoke from a young age, to sit in solitude and silence when it weighs heavy, to lay one's head in the dust. Maybe there's hope. To offer one's cheek to the striker, to have one's fill of disgrace. For the Lord will not reject anyone forever. If he brings grief, he will have pity out of the fullness of his faithful love. For it is not for his own pleasure that he torments and grieves the human race. Those words are in the center of the Book of Lamentations. The musically inclined among you might have heard the verses that frame the lyrics of the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. But the end of Lamentations is more nuanced. It refuses to give a saccharine, sweet, nice ending to catastrophe. To do so would be to cheapen the very real, dread-filled emotions of the book. Chapter 5, verses 9 through 22 contains 19 to 22, contains strains of hope, strains of despair, and names the deep anxiety produced by the dreadful situation. It is brutally honest, and I will give it the last word. Yet you, O Lord, rule from eternity. Your throne endures from age to age, yes. Why do you never remember us? Why do you abandon us so long? Make us come back to you, O Lord, and we will come back. Restore us as we were before. Unless you've utterly rejected us in anger which knows no limit. That's the end of Lamentations and the end of this sermon. I'm not going to blunt it, but I do wish you well. Amen.